Log on, tune in, find out. Another good idea from Cambridge.
You would like to begin by telling me something about your background, where you grew up and how that influenced your decision to become an anthropologist.
Yeah. Well, of course, can be a very long story. But I suppose I should say first that I was a child of two academics, a couple of academics anyway. My father was the dean of a medical school at Washington University in St. Louis, and he was a biochemist who became a pediatrician and then a dean. And he was a researcher, very scientific chap. And he was also an outdoorsman. He took me hiking, canoeing and swimming and things like that. He was himself a horseback rider and was the first doctor in Yellowstone Park when it was still an army post before it was a national park. But I lost him when I was 12 years old. He died of some botched surgery. And then I had my mother's family, who were also in academia. My mother's father was the dean of architecture at Washington U, and also an actor and a poet and a Latin scholar, and did a lot of travel in Europe in order to get ideas for his architecture. So I had the arts on one side and the sciences on the other. And they were, in a sense, displaced persons in St. Louis because they were both from the East Coast. My mother was from New York area, and my father from Baltimore. And in moving to St. Louis, which they did fairly early in the century, 1910 or something like that, they thought of it as going to the frontier, exploring new territory. They were sort of bringing culture to the Midwest, which did not have many paved roads even at the time. But they were starting a couple of institutions there. So that was their situation. And of course I met a lot of doctors and artists and all kinds of people in St. Louis. So it was a rather rich start in life, you might say. But my father was appointed to the University of California when I was 12 years old, and became the dean of the medical school at San Francisco. So again, I have a good deal of academic exposure. We set up a house in Berkeley, but then he shortly died. That kind of interrupted my education, but I got back to St. Louis with my mother a year later, having missed most of the sciences that I should have had in beginning high school. But the school was of very liberal persuasion, and they said, well, you can do the arts if you want to do that. And I had done arts. I'd done lots of French and some Latin and painting and music and history, and so that was fine as far as the school was concerned, and I didn't have to do a lot of chemistry, which I had none of actually, or even very much math, which I regretted, but I couldn't. I hadn't got on the escalator at the right time, and therefore I had to defer that. But I enjoyed doing literary things, and I ran a school magazine, a couple of school magazines for a couple of years there, and enjoyed that, and wrote a lot. I liked to write, and I got myself a national scholarship to Harvard, and went off there. I arrived there just in the very quarter, the semester was there, when Pearl Harbor was struck by the Japanese. I was 17, I'd gone to college a bit early, and so I wasn't drafted immediately. All the 18-year-olds were drafted at that point, which left the freshman class, the sophomore class at Harvard rather small. But I should backtrack a little and say that I had taken up my father's lead and done a little horseback riding in the Rockies, summer camp, and then had taken up youth hosteling. I was eager to go to Europe, but with Hitler there, couldn't do that. So I settled for bicycle riding in the United States. And I loved the country. I loved being in rural areas. And it was possible then to bicycle around in a large part of the country without worrying about too many automobiles. There were no super highways then, and everything was rather slow. And so I used all my vacation times for touring. I ultimately went through 14 states and several parts of Canada on a bicycle with a friend in my teens, and sleeping in mostly farms where the youth hostels were. And I liked that a whole lot. And I'd done some drawing, and so I took a long pencil and paper and drew a lot of landscapes and some people and things like that. It generally oriented me to rural living. So I continued that as far as possible in college, but I had intended to go into anthropology, actually, before I went there. In fact, I chose Harvard because there was some undergraduate anthropology there in the person of Clyde Kluckholm. And you've met him or heard of him?
Heard of him, of course.
Well, he was actually in Washington, D.C. I think probably some military outfit had called him to Washington. He was being consulted after Pearl Harbor by people who wanted to know about how you deal with other nations, cultures, and psychologies, and so on. So I didn't see him, but they said, well, you can do some other major, it doesn't matter too much in your freshman year, you've got to do all sorts of things anyway. History, world history, and language, and so and the college said, you've got to do something useful in the war, so study German, or so I'll study German, and so I did that for a year. Clyde wasn't there, but I took up as a major art history, which was congenial as far as I was concerned. I wanted to do that sort of thing anyhow, but it wasn't what I intended to major. So I did that for a while, and they said, well, you can, I didn't know whether Clyde was coming back or not, so you can go into the artillery. Of course, you'll need a little more math for that, or you can do, you're an art student, all right, you can paint camouflage on tanks or airplanes or something. Well, that didn't appeal to me too much. Then they said, in my second year, you've done German. Yeah, I liked the languages, that was fine. I did a little, well anyway, but we have a program in Japanese, so you can study Japanese, and there's a great need for Japanese translators. They had I actually wanted my intention for other parts of the world that I wanted to go to beside Europe was China. I'd done a lot of time at the St. Louis Art Museum, which had a pretty good collection of ancient bronzes, which absolutely astonished me. And also the calligraphy interested me greatly. And so I really thought I would like to be a sinologist and an anthropological sinologist, I guess. I was domiciled in Harvard Yard right next to the Chinese library collection, and that was very intriguing to me. But the thought of then being useful in Japanese was very attractive, so I took that up and crammed Japanese. They had a super intensive course taught by an old white Russian named Sergei Eliseev, who was a wonderful character. He lived years in Japan. I guess he left Soviet. When the Soviet became Soviet, he left and had resided in Japan. But in any case, I found Japanese quite easy too, and was happy with another language. And they said, then if you go into, but then Clyde came back the second year, so then I had practically all my courses with him. I studied, I think I had 5 different courses, and he was my tutor also. So I just saw him practically every day for about a year, which was great. I really got an inside view, got all his personal opinions of things as well as the courses that he taught. So with all that, I then volunteered for early induction into the military. They didn't really want any more people than they were swamped with 18-year-olds. But they said, well, I thought, they'll send me to Washington and I'll do some more Japanese. Right away, no, they sent me to the infantry. So I had infantry training and became an infantry instructor for a while. And after, it was about a year later, I got finally back to Japanese. Got reclassified and then spent some time at Stanford doing more Japanese and then some more in Washington, D.C. And after another year of that, and by then they said, well, we need volunteers to go to Kunming to help Chiang Kai-shek defend China against the Japanese. Well, I've been rather interested in China. In fact, politically, sentimentally caught up in the Sino-Japanese hostilities, and so I thought that would be great. I could help oppose the Japanese takeover of China, and feeling young and foolish at age 20, I stepped forward. And they asked for volunteers, and I then was sent to India by way of a troop ship, which tried to get away from the Japanese naval sphere by going somewhere around the Arctic Ocean, south of Australia, and around to the back door of China, which was India. So at age 21, I stepped ashore in Bombay and was then thinking, well, they'll send me through India to Assam and then over the hump into China. And spent a week on a milk train, carrying a rifle and doing all sorts of things to secure our life. I spent a couple of months in Indian Army camps and trying to drive a British Land Rover, which was entirely new to me. But I was posting the guard, I was doing all sorts of military things. I didn't think I was well cut out for that life, but I didn't mind living in a tent or anything. So, but then they said, well, we're not going to send you over to Kunming after all. We got to Calcutta because Chiang Kai-shek is retreating up the Yangtze, and we don't want to send any more people there. It'd be better we can receive Japanese radio messages in Almora, in the Himalayas, and so you can just work from there. So they sent me instead to New Delhi, and I sat there and worked there in a post office building. It was a little postal station in the middle of Connaught Circus in New Delhi, and it was a secret thing. They brought us in there at night, and I was worked on a swing shift, which I did because I wanted to use the daylight hours as much as possible when I could be awake to see something of India. But that was all British Empire then, of course, and Churchill didn't want Americans in India, but of course he had to have them because the Americans had the airplanes and the other material and so on, and so there were Americans there, and all kinds of guys, most of them operating secretly from each other. We had very little idea of what was going on there, except that we were in our little post office, hideaway, translating Japanese radio messages, which were written down in pencil by sleepy Indian radio operators in Almora with lots of mistakes. So it was pretty much garbled stuff. And we had to translate those into Chinese telegraphic code using codebook and correct all the mistakes they'd made, which wasn't easy because you didn't know it was a mistake until you translated it, and you had to translate it before you could tell what the mistakes were. So it was pretty difficult and messy work. But anyway, that's what I did for 8 hours of a shift for 6 months until the Japanese surrendered. And that happened while I was there in India. So we had a little victory parade. At that point I had no rifle, but we could just sort of shoulder our pencils or something. But Churchill hadn't wanted the Americans there, so the consequence was that we weren't supposed to fraternize with Indians. Well, of course, it was impossible to be there and not deal with Indians. We had Indian servants in the dorms where we lived, and of course they were around us all over everywhere else. But we weren't supposed to learn any Indian languages. So all we had were little books that say, what time is it, and where's the bathroom, that sort of thing. But I think one or two of my fellow soldiers used the bearers, their servants in the dorms, to study Hindi. But I didn't. I just spent my time usually going around looking at things visually, sketching people and places around Delhi, which was interesting. It was, of course, loaded with history of all kinds. We had very few books. There was nothing. I think I read 3 or 4 books on India. Is about all I had by way of preparation. So I was relying very largely on my eyes. But I was fascinated by, say, villages that I could see. I could travel around on a bike nearby and see these mud walls and villages behind the walls. And I was very curious about what was going on there as an anthropologist. Would-be anthropologist, I had to learn a lot more. Of course, I knew that I couldn't at the time, but I resolved that I would try to come back and do that. So that's what happened. And then as the Japanese surrendered, I was shipped back right away to Washington by air at this time, and told I needed now to study Chinese. Well, I suppose I'd learned 5,000 characters, but of course they were not the same in Chinese. But I didn't mind learning another language, so I went to work in Washington, D.C. in the Signal Corps. This was all Signal Corps operations. And studied Chinese. But my instructor, who was on leave, a professor from Harvard, he was in service himself, but he got out of uniform. And in fact, I got out of uniform rather early because of my 6-month overseas service. And most of the people who've been sitting in Washington all the time didn't get out so soon. But I then had the choice, would I go to the the occupation in Japan? Would I work for them? Or would I re-enlist? Or would, just what would I do? And I had a couple of months to think about it, watched a lot of Japanese movies and discovered that there were at least 200 American naval officers who knew a lot more Japanese than I did because they'd had a conversational practice with prisoners and so on. So I decided I was way behind in the Japanese language business, and I would need several more years of training. I came to Chicago at that point because I had 2.5 years of Harvard. They had a long list of requirements that I had to fulfill to get a BA. At the same time, Hutchins here at Chicago was offering, I guess, cut rate degrees for Army veterans. They said, well, you've got all this Japanese now, so you got the equivalent of a BA in Japanese. And all you do is to take a few comprehensive exams over other matters, language and sociology and history and a few things like that. And I did those, and that was okay. And so they said, well, you have the equivalent of a BA now, so you go right ahead for your master's degree. I chose that. I had chosen anthropology. I should go back a bit there and say that I got into that partly because my sister, much older than I, 9 years older, had married, had come to the University of Chicago and as an undergraduate in the college, and had married a graduate student in anthropology, a social anthropologist here, and he was very enthusiastic.
So you jumped ship from Harvard. You actually completed your BA here, and then went directly into.
Well, I took the equivalent. Yeah, right.
And went directly into. Let me ask you a question that intrigued me about Clyde Kalman, since in the Peabody used to see his name painted on one of the doors. I think David Maybury Lewis occupied his office later on.
Kalman's name is to it?
Yeah. What was Clyde Kalman like?
Well, I found him just very friendly and engaging, and a passionate sort of person, in the sense that he sort of struggled over the ideas and said, this is very important, and he had a sense of excitement about it. And he would sort of look off into space, and he seemed imaginative in that way also. He seemed to be quite orderly, and he assigned interesting books for me to read, and he was happy. I met him as a tutor about every second week, and he would usually give me 2 or 3 books to read before the next session, and I'm supposed to write papers about them and come read them to him. So he was very demanding, but he was also very receptive to my papers, and he was pleased and encouraging. So.
Was this the period when social relations was?
No, it wasn't. But he advised me when he became my advisor then in my second year, and he said, "Well, you ought to study with Talcott Parsons, and you ought to study also get some depth psychology." And so I studied with what's his name, T.A.T. Man, and with White, who was a psychoanalyst, and so I did a bit of psychology. I hated the ordinary psychology, but I liked the deep stuff. So I had a course with, 2 courses, I guess, with Parsons. It was on America, on the American family, or American occupational system, something like that. And a good sampling of the roots of Sacrell.
Now, when you started your graduate program in Chicago, did you have the idea that you were going to return to India to do field work?
Well, that happened after I got here. I think I brought my story up to my deciding to come to Chicago rather than to go back to Harvard at that point. And when I got here, people said, well, now Fred Egan had been here. He was the head of the Japanese training program that they had here. So he said, well, you could do Japanese. But on the other hand, here you've been in India. Nobody has been in India before you. There was one person, I think David Applebaum, who was an anthropologist who'd worked, I think he'd gone in on the coattails of Murray Emino, who was a linguist. The British Empire did not want social scientists, and social sounded dangerous and science sounded even worse, I guess. So they didn't really, encourage this. But here, during the war, when I came back from India, I was in Washington for another 6 months, and I met Jeffrey Gorer there, who had been around all places all around the world. He'd been in Bali and Africa, and he'd gone to Sikkim, and he said he'd wanted. I met him in Washington just socially, at a dance, I think, or something. And he said, "What do you want to do in India?" And I said, "Well, I'd like to study peasants." And he said, "You can't do that. They lie to you all the time. They won't tell you the truth, And I said, "Well, what is your experience?" And he said, "Well, I wanted originally to work in Bihar, and that was, of course, a very troubled area, and they had a lot of resistance to the empire there, and he was British, and so he came in. The officials there were reluctant to let him in even, but the villagers apparently were really hostile to him because they saw him as some kind of an official who was inquiring into their affairs. So he said, "You can't do that." But I said, "Well, maybe we have other ways of operating. It won't be so bad." Yeah. What you were asking?
Yeah, about your decision to return to India.
Yeah, that's right. So nobody had been there. There was nobody in this university. There was one retired missionary who was teaching in the divinity school, and who had actually spent some years in India. Nobody else. Nobody on the faculty. I could study. They had no Indian languages taught except Sanskrit and Pali, and they were taught by the Russian literature person who had learned Sanskrit and Pali in St. Petersburg at the Language Academy. He was a white Russian prince, actually, who had a lot of linguistic background, but it was remote, and he knew a little Indian history, and he read a bit. And he was a very, very good literature scholar, a nice guy, Georgi Bobrinskoy, but he didn't know about India, really. So I did what I could, but there was nobody here. On the other hand, Fred Egan said, "Well, look, we've got a very good library, start of a very good library here, because William Rainey Harper, the founder of the university, had wanted to do all of the Asian languages, and as much as he could, certainly the classical ones. So he had originally had a professor of Sanskrit here, and I think they'd had a couple of others, but they had none for the last 20 years, so before I arrived. So, but they had a library. They bought a library. They bought up a whole Berlin bookstore, which was full of books about India, a large part of it Sanskrit. But they also had lots of the Indian census and missionary monographs and British official memoirs and things like that. So they said, so Fred said, "Well, we really need somebody to work on India, and this is a wonderful opportunity. And it's just starting up now, and you can be in at the beginning of this venture and I was studying, of course, it was Lloyd Warner also, and community studies were the thing to do, and I wanted to study a village, perfect fit. So Fred said, we just read everything in this library and then you'll be ready to go. So I did.
You must have presented some challenge that there was no faculty advisor who was familiar with the region.
No, so I had to look for others, and I found a few Indian students around. There was no general importation of Indians, but there were one or two. There were really one or two. And then other people hanging around, you know, whoever they were, the wife of somebody, and so on. And I found another graduate student there named Phillips Talbot, who was a fellow of the Institute of Current World Affairs, which was training people for the State Department. It was totally non-official, but it was a private foundation that thought that Americans needed to know a lot more about the rest of the world than they did. So they were training people, giving them long periods of 5-year appointments or something like that to learn all about this or that part of the world. And one of these persons was a man who later was in the State Department, but he was an officer in India, a naval officer in India, Phil Talbot. He was here, and he'd already spent 3 or 4 years in India, and he had lots of interesting connections. He met all kinds of people and lived for long times and in different parts of India. So he was a great source for me, and putting me in touch with people. So he knew about the best missionaries, the ones who'd been there a long time and were sort of social science oriented. So I wrote to William Weiser, his wife, who'd written a book called Behind Mud Walls, which is a very useful introduction. And I just began then collecting people all over. So I had a huge index finally of people to write, and so I wrote letters to everybody, you know, dozens and dozens of letters asking for their advice. Where to work, what would be interesting, what did they know, how does one do it, and so on. Well, I had a lot of help from all these people.
And you went to do your first field work in the early 50s
Yeah.
in Uttar Pradesh.
Yeah, that's right.
And what was tell us about your field work, if you would.
Sure. Well, the field work was sponsored by the Social Science Research Council, and they had just, at that point, just after the ending of World War II, they had gone into the foreign studies field, which they hadn't done before. They'd been sticking pretty much to, I think, to the Western world anyway, if not the U.S. But they had started a foreign area fellowship program, and I was number 1 in line. So they gave me a year and a half of what was then a lot of money, $10,000 for a year and a half. And I found that would stretch a bit further too. So I wrote a proposal, which was all about what was happening to caste in India with the changes of the new constitution, all the new ambitions and legislation that was going on, and how did this look at the village level? So I was going to, that was the program basically. I was going to watch I didn't quite put it that way, but the falling apart of the caste system. Totally misconceived, but anyhow, that won the fellowship. So by then I had a wife and 2 children, small ones, and we went off on we couldn't afford anything fancy, and there wasn't anything much, and we certainly couldn't go by air. That was extremely rare and very expensive in 1950. So we had to go by boat, and the only boat we could get was a freighter. So we got on a steel pipe carrying boat, which was going to deliver American pipe to some oil industries in the Mideast. We thought it was going to be Israel. It turned out not to be. But we went through Lebanon and Egypt and so on. Took a month. And headed for a place that had been recommended by Wisers, who were about 150, maybe 175 miles from Delhi, southeast of Delhi, where they'd been working for 30 years. And they said, well, why don't you work somewhere halfway from us to Delhi? And that would be an interesting area, maybe a bit more advanced in technology and so on. They were leaving then. Weiser was suffering from terminal disease at the time, though he was still in another village. So I called on them and visited them also in Lucknow, the state capital. I started at the top. I had nice letters of introduction from the university here to whoever it may be in India, and that was a very good thing to do. And I went with went to the chief people in Uttar Pradesh to get their blessings or approval. I met the leading social science people, especially the sociologists at Lucknow University, where they actually had somebody who called himself an anthropologist, and a couple of sociologists, one of whom was really a philosopher, and the other was a real sociologist, really interested in village work. And they interested me again, and so I got on to the district capital, turned out to be Aligarh district, and found that Aligarh was in some turmoil because they'd had lots of, after the partition between India and Pakistan, they'd had a large number of refugees both ways. That is, it had been a center of Muslim nobility. They'd been urged to cluster around the Aligarh Muslim University, which was patronized by the imperial government. But the Nawabs who built palaces there in Aligarh, many of them had left for Pakistan as soon as partition was declared, leaving their houses, and the windows were broken and some of them were burned, and it was quite a mess. And on the other direction, there were lots of Hindus coming in from Pakistan territories into Aligarh, and they had their trains had been hijacked, and hundreds of passengers had been slaughtered, and so had those who were walking, and it was just, and the people around who'd done the murders were still there. You know, they were the Hindu leaders, some of them, right-wing Hindus, and at that time, the tensions were such that the United Nations, UNESCO, I guess it was, if they come into being then, I'm not sure, I don't remember the exact agency, but they'd set up a program to study under United Nations auspices social tensions in India, that is, to try to reduce the troubles. And it was to be headed up by Gardner Murphy, who was a social psychologist. And Murphy, I had met Murphy because I knew about the program going on, but he was about to start in India before I'd gone there, when I was getting ready to go to India. So, and he was very eager to have me there. I'd already by then, I'd done a good deal of psychology here too at Chicago, Human Development Committee. It was especially welcoming. Lloyd Warner was in human development as well as in anthropology and sociology, or maybe he moved about that time. Anyways, he put me in touch with people like Bill Henry, who was a TAT and man, and I studied Rorschach and so on. So Murphy thought, well, this is great to get somebody who knows something about these projective tests, and we were going to study the emotions behind the riots and all that. So he wanted to co-opt me into his team with investigators in Elliger, and they were studying riots. Well, that was not a comfortable position to be in politically, because the collector, they had a riot just 6 months before I arrived there, and I, as an investigator from abroad, an American and a social scientist would be something of a threat, because he had been responsible, he'd been held responsible for not sending in the police to stop the riot, but he let a Muslim athletic instructor get murdered by a mob. And so he was blamed for that, and naturally he worried about my investigation of this very touchy topic. So I had to steer clear. I refused to become a part of Murphy's team that was right there, but he had brought in a psychoanalyst who was himself a refugee from Pakistan, named Parsram. Parsram was a wonderful psychoanalyst. He just an absolutely charming man with enormous knowledge and very broad liberal views. He'd been trained in Murphy's own institute in the U.S. Had been there before, and he was well acquainted with faculty here in University of Chicago. We hadn't met here, but I met him there, and he was next door neighbor. So it was very hard. And he was then the head of the local team. Well, I hung out with him a lot and learned a lot from him, but I couldn't join his team officially. But I helped his staff a little bit, but I really didn't want to teach them. I didn't want to get deeply involved in it. My job was to get into rural areas. So I had a Jeep. I brought one from the USA, actually, on that freighter. Began touring the rural areas. I had maps and census statistics and so on. I said I wanted to see what villages were like there. What was the range of types of villages and kinds of populations and so on, and occupations and everything else. I wanted a general survey of the district before I settled on any one spot. And I visited, I think, 75 villages and interviewed briefly for maybe an hour or two at least in each of them. And this was, again, rather upsetting to the local officials. The official had said, yes, you can come and so on. I encouraged friendly feelings by the collector, the head officer of the district, who was an Indian. Of course, he recently appointed to the position previously occupied by a British officer. He was having a wedding for his daughter. And we'd also arrived just a couple of months before the annual fair, county fair, you might say, of the district, where they had musical performances and things like that. And I had a tape recorder that I'd picked up in England. So I made recordings of what is called a mushaira, which is a poetic contest in poetry and song between dueling poets. And the idea of recording this was very attractive to the singers, naturally, to the poets. So they set me right up on the stage there with this thing, and I recorded these dialogues, which helped my language learning. I had practically no language. Only language I'd learned ahead of coming was just from a set of phonograph records that had been made during the war and not used by anybody. But that put me up a bit anyway, and so I began to learn Urdu and Hindi and just Margaret Mead methods. That is, you go and you imitate people, and you make mistakes, and they correct you, and pretty soon you're speaking the language. That's what I did. But this was a great help. In any case, I took these recordings, these musical things, which are greatly prized, and it was in a Muslim setting, though there were Hindus present, all kinds of poets who are present. The language is really very similar. But then at this wedding, at the collector's wedding, he said, well, you were at the fair, at the Nimish, and you have recordings of this and so why don't you bring it over? So I did, and that was a great hit. The wedding party, you see. So I had some credits with the man, even though he was worried about me. His spies then were going around giving reports on my activities in the rural areas, which he was, uncertain about. And he said, he called me in, and he said, is there a reason why I shouldn't throw you out of this district? I have reports that you've been inquiring about my administration. No, I hadn't been inquiring about his administration except to ask, who was the head man of the village. That was about it, but that was dangerous information as far as he was concerned. Well, I somehow or other toughed that one out. But he said he was going to keep his eye on me. So anyway, settling the village was a bit of a problem because I was actually thrown out of 3 villages before I was able to settle where I wanted. I'd go into one place where I wanted a village that represented the whole range of, I wanted a fairly complex village where I had lots of different castes. I was supposed to study caste relations. So I wanted a place that wasn't just one caste of people in the village, 1 or 2, and there are a lot of villages like that, where there are just farmers and 1 or 2 other castes in small villages of 500 or so. Well, I wanted a place small enough so that I could know everybody. That was the anthropological aim, of course, to do the whole community, which means you know everybody, more or less. And so it had to be pretty small, but it also had to be complex. So I found several places that were right. I certainly wanted Brahmins, and there were plenty of Brahmins around in that region. Not like South India, but northwestern part of Uttar Pradesh has lots of Brahmins there of all kinds, or not necessarily priests at all, but farmers mostly. So in any case, I found one village had a lot of Brahmins in it, and they even had a local temple, and I thought, well, that would be great too. It was important. It wasn't just a local temple, it was a regional temple that had people come. They had an annual 2 or 3 festivals every year, and a community, a local community. But it seemed that they said, oh yes, you come back, live. Everybody always says, yes, sure, yeah, whatever you want, yes. But I went back, and they said, well, we'll have a house for you. And I got there, and they showed me the pig pen. It was a place that had been occupied by a local pig herd, and he died, but his little mud hut, in the yard for the pigs, that was it. I figured, well, that wasn't too welcoming, And then I realized that after some study of reading the gazetteers and things like that, they looked like a fairly wealthy community, and they had this pretty fancy temple that clearly they hadn't built, but been built by the local Raja, the Raja who'd been there at the beginning of the 19th century, before the British takeover. He'd built this thing, and the reason why it was so well stocked with Brahmins and land grants and so on was because they were his funeral priests. And funeral priests take all the bad stuff along with the dead. So that's why, but they were quite isolated. They didn't. I inquired about their marriages and things like that. Nobody married them except their own little cluster of Brahmins, because they were negatively toned, and as far as other Brahmins were concerned. So they were a little uncomfortable again about me learning too much about them. I don't know what else they were involved in. So that was the pig pen story. Then I went to another village which looked like about the right kind of place again, which had lots of farmers in it and quite a few castes. Well, let's see, actually, there was a cluster, there were 3 or 4 villages together that formed a sort of group. And I thought, well, that would be interesting too. You see the relation between the smaller and the larger villages. I met a merchant. No, I guess it was, how did that happen? I met a merchant. I also met an office boy in Elliger who he had just had a wedding, his own daughter's wedding, and he had a spare house. He built a house for the bridegroom, who didn't stay there, he was just there for the wedding days, and he wanted to rent it. And that was in one of these little, this cluster of villages. Well, I went there, so I had 2 or 3 contacts. And I talked to one man who was quite fluent in English, a merchant of the Elliger lock industry. And he was very eager to meet me, and very friendly and comfortable with me, because he was an urban person who lived in a village, but he was doing this urban, he was a traveling salesman for the lock industry, so he was fairly sophisticated, urbanite type. And he said, well, there's a village near here where he had a friend and who was a Vaid, a Muslim doctor, and he would probably be glad to have you living in his place. And he thought there were some empty spaces there that I could use. Went there, and they said, oh yes, you can come here. Well, okay, so I spent another couple of days there, around there. It seemed like a suitable place, but as I spent the night there and listened to the conversation, I had an interpreter working with me then, a man from the city, from another city, and he said, well, they're bootleggers, and they're worried about you're bringing the police here, you know, and so they didn't want to, you know, they weren't comfortable about it at all. So that didn't work out either. And then the merchant said, well, I've got another friend over here, and this other village, and that was the one that I really liked a whole lot when I first saw it, because it had an old mound, you know, it had obviously been there for hundreds and hundreds of years, and on top, some of the villages up on top of the mound, and the very top was a fortress, a mud fortress, which had been used had cannon on it, I think, in the early 19th century, and probably earlier too, because anyway, and it was much larger, and it had a lot of Brahmins, it had 24 castes represented in it. So that was perfect, you know. And the friend turned out to be a Jat landlord who lived in the castle up top. Not much of a castle, but fancier than anything else in the village. And he was very friendly, because he needed friends, for one thing. He was the majority of the people in the village, the control of the village, not the majority of people. 1/4 of the population were Brahmin farmers. And they were subject to the Jats who had taken over in the 17th century during the sort of crumbling of the Mughal authority. The Jats had moved in from across the Jamna River into that area, and had taken over, and they were pretty rough on the local Brahmins, who were otherwise, they had a Rajput king before. The Rajput had been driven out, and the Jats took over. In any case, the Jats, as rulers now, were demanding that the Brahmins give them a lot of deference. They had to stand up whenever the landlord walked by and do all kinds of things that were sort of very irritating to the Brahmins, who thought they were the top people. But this landlord, then, who was the remaining Jat landlord, there were a few others, 2 or 3 others, but he was the only one who really had any land still under his own control. But he was eager to have me, and he had a little English, and he had a son in high school, and thought, well, that would be a good thing to have. And then he found this office boy, city office boy, who had the house to rent. And that was in the potter's quarter, actually. My neighbors were there was a cotton carter, a group of potters, and a couple of Muslim families. That was the neighborhood in the village.
And the idea was that by having a village that had all of that was richly represented by caste, you could study the dynamics.
Right, I could study, and it turned out to be just wonderful for that purpose because, well, I moved in and to this house. People were very suspicious of me. Of course, they wondered what in the world was going to bring me there. But I had a nice greeting because I told them I was going to come, and then I got loaded up my Jeep and came down there. I was alone. I installed my wife and children in a house in Ellicott City, which had a decent well and so on. The village didn't have anything like that. The well was just a hole in the ground. It wasn't even improved, just a hole in the dirt, you know. And that didn't look like a safe situation for a couple of toddlers. So, in any case, whatever it is, I moved into this house, and I found waiting for me 8 servants in a little one-room house for me and my translator. And they said they all belonged to the house. They were part, and so I was immediately immersed in this, and I was their master. And so there was the carpenter who could repair the door, or the people who would plaster the place with cow dung plaster to refreshen it every now and then, you know, when it got too dry and dusty. There was the water carrier, and there was somebody to haul away the trash, and there was the barber who went with it and used to cut my hair and wash my dishes.
And you were expected to be their employer.
I was their employer. Wonderful. Here I am, the gas system. All of a sudden, you know.
How do you think you met as far as the expectations of what you had originally written your grant for, the so-called disintegration of the caste system? How?
Well, see, they hadn't heard about the disintegration of the caste system, except they're worried about me disintegrating the caste system. What happened was the barber, who was, I was so lucky. I got this barber. He was about 60 years old, had about half his teeth, but he was very garrulous, and he wanted to talk about everything and everybody. And the barber's wife, they're the midwives, and they're the hairdressers. And the barbers, of course, know what's going with the men. And the barbers are the people who carry all the wedding invitations and do the wedding negotiations and all kinds of things like that. So it was an absolute goldmine of information, this barber. And he would know about everything. You know, I'd say, well, what about so-and-so? Well, he's doing this and that, and his daughters and his sons, and, you know, everybody's information was right there. So, great. I thought, lovely, you know, I'll hire this man. Oh, he was crazy to be hired because I was going to pay him in cash, you know, not kind. They did a lot of barter, but I didn't have anything else to barter, but plenty of money. So he was really eager to do this, and I signed him up right away. He was going to wash my dishes. Well, my dishes consisted of 2 metal plates. That was about it, you know. And he was going to bring water and put it in my tanky. And there was no running water, of course, but I had a sort of big container for water with a spigot on it. Well, the next day he came to me, he said, sorry, I've got to quit. I can't work for you. Why not? Because my Brahmin patrons would be polluted by you. If he washes my dishes, he would be polluted. Now that had great implications because most of his best customers were Brahmins. And not only that, but he had a daughter to marry, another Brahmin. And she couldn't marry anybody because he would be polluted, she would be. So everything depended on that. And the Brahmins were very upset with me because I was going to destroy their service system, invalidate and the whole caste of barbers And the reason why it was a bigger village, it had 1,100 people in it. No, it was about 850 then. But one reason why it had 24 calves in it, because they were serving all the surrounding little villages around. And the barbers, there was a whole lot of barbers there, they were serving 10 other villages. So this would be a terrible, this is the jugular vein, you might say, that I was threatening by asking this man to wash my dishes. So then I began, follow this out, and there was a very hostile reaction by the Brahmins. And they thought, of course, that I would eat meat and throw bones around and generally disrupt things and sit with the untouchables in the village and threaten. And then, of course, rumors. Oh my goodness, so many rumors they had about me, the terrible things that I'd done, and I would hear this through my interpreter or through the barber. I kept the barber around anyway. I didn't make him wash the dishes, but he was, he was a very welcome visitor to my house whenever I could get him in. He loved to come and hang around anyhow. So, but the rumors were terrific. Well, it just happened that in another village 10 miles away, another anthropologist had arrived. And this was a woman named Gittel Steed, Gittel Poznansky Steed, who had come from Columbia University. The Columbia University program in other cultures had been financed by the Office of Naval Research, and again part of the war morale business. And she had been intending to work in China, as had my professor Robert Redfield here. In fact, he was in China, and then the communists took over. He was in a village not far from Beijing, but he was thrown out by the communists, asked to leave. And so she, from Columbia, that project, which was also going to be in China, was terminated. But the Columbia people said, we got all this money, and the Office of Naval Research doesn't ask for it back, so how about we go to India instead? Well, so they'd gone to India on a moment's notice, and they'd been working in Gujarat for a year. But then they moved over. They worked on a Hindu village in Gujarat, in Western India, and then they wanted to do a Muslim village, and they chose an Aligarh district. This was entirely, I had no idea they were coming, but people said, well, there's another anthropologist here. So I heard, and that was Gittel Steed, and she came with a fairly large party of assistants. Now, where were we?
Well, one question was how you ended up navigating the matrix of all of these caste dynamics.
Well, I did all the usual anthropological things. That is, I tried to get acquainted with every family in the village. I did genealogies, get names of everybody. Of course, I got a lot of false names and crazy information, the way Jeffrey Gore said I would. People were afraid of me, of course. But they had rumors. They thought I was going to take all the children and put them in orphanages the way the missionaries had done during famines. They had these stories, about the way these foreigners act. They'd never seen an American before. Most of them had never seen any European person before, as a matter of fact, in that village, because it was way out in the sticks. I chose a place that was as far as possible from any regular lines of communication, so that it would have all the more conservative features, and it certainly did. But they were worried, and my colleague Gittel Steed over there, she was relatively naive. She didn't have any Indian languages at all. But she was a psychologist. She'd done a lot of work with Margaret Mead. She was Margaret Mead and Morris Carstairs was on her staff initially in Gujarat. He was a psychoanalyst doctor, medical doctor who'd been come under Margaret Mead's aegis when he was posted in New York during the war. But anyhow, Carstairs, well, she as a where was I? Complicated story. The rumors, that was she was she solved the rumor problem for me, because she had rumors, and they had developed a technique in Gujarat for collecting rumors about themselves. And so they would collect the rumors and read them back to the villagers every night when they had a new collection of rumors. And of course, the people who were nearby, their neighbors and so on, knew these were false rumors in many cases. And they would be amused by these rumors. And that's what I did, and it worked wonderfully. And we had a lovely time. We had sort of evening parties reading rumors about ourselves, you know. And of course, the villagers were pretty good at making up rumors. And you know, I'd cut off the breast of a barber woman in order to get this house, and I was going to take over all the fields and start up a collective farm, or I was going to build a skyscraper. The only idea they had, you see, many of the people I had, was from these little peep shows, that little thing they go around the village, you know, and they had pictures of New York skyscrapers and things like that. And so they figured, yeah, I was going to build a skyscraper. That's how the Americans get these tremendous yields from their fields, by making one on top of the other. So they were going to, anyway, I was going to take, you know, all these crazy things I was going to do. Dangerous guy.
Now, there was right at that time, if I'm not mistaken, there was a rich cohort of people who were beginning to study South Asia at that time, at around the time that you began also.
Yes,
So
others came in, yes. Morris Carstairs, not Morris, Morris Oppler from Cornell had set up a program in East UP, and then set up another one in West. But apparently he didn't get on very well with the Lucknow people. And he had these two stations in Uttar Pradesh, and he offended them somehow, and they felt some rivalry, and ultimately made it very unpleasant for him. So he had to leave. But he had some students, and some of his students got into trouble. He had a team. They built a big bungalow in one of his villages, which then housed the field workers. I think that was a mistake. They weren't living the life of the people. They weren't doing participant observation, really. And they were much more focused. They went in and they were going to study this or that particular topic, and they were relatively narrow people. I was in a small community trying to do everything. My idea was holistic research. Well, ultimately I did. So I tried various social psychological questionnaires and things like that that were focused, but that were focused as part of the whole thing. I mean, I asked people to describe each other, and so I was interested in the terms they used for the descriptions, and I generally asked open-ended questions. I used TATs and picture stories and so on. I didn't find those things very useful, though, really, because people were so full of stories anyway, that I didn't really need to show them pictures to get them to talk. They're very talkative people, very, very talkative. So that part was easy.
And then you said that you were studying with Robert Redfield. He became your graduate advisor.
Well, he did. He wasn't ever, no, actually, but he was, of course, cooking up big designs for India, and he wanted to study the whole he wanted to study civilizations, and he'd been an ambulance driver in World War I in France, and he was a pacifist, and he was just so sick of war. And he wanted to do anything with the new United Nations being formed that would promote mutual understanding among nations. That was his major motivation in starting this. And they got this big foundation. Grant He, with Milton Singer, philosopher turned anthropologist here. They were just taking over. Milton hadn't come to the department while I was there in training. But Redfield was there just as I was coming back. But in fact, before I'd come back, he was writing me letters. And I had gone to some of these seminars. I'd never taken a course with him, actually. And he was not my advisor, but he was my guru in another sense. And I was very impressed with him, and I liked him a lot. And I was a teaching assistant for him, I think, a year before I went. And I felt very, very happy with him as an intellectual inspirer. And he then began asking big questions, you know, about the civilization as a whole. And so he was interested in, he and Milton developed this idea of the great and little traditions, which I didn't think was a good idea at all, but nevertheless it was clear that I could answer a lot of questions about that. That is, the different, we have these Sanskrit level, you know, somehow or other. M.N. Srinivas, leading Indian sociologist, had been very cordial to me also. Srinivas had just taken over the professorship in Baroda, sociology department at University of Baroda. And when I came to India, and I called on him, and he was very, very welcoming and very eager to have other anthropologists working on, and to do this sort of holistic. Well, then Srinivas and Singer got together. Singer was then working in India for most of the year, I think. So they got acquainted, and that brought me together with the whole question of, you know, and brought Singer into the great and little issue. While I didn't think, I liked the idea of doing the whole, that holism idea was terribly important to me. Do the whole civilization, to see everything in the largest possible context. You know, start worldview, everything. That's really get cosmology from the villager up, and whatever the social relations are that connect the higher and the lower levels and so on. Well, I can see lots of evidence for that going on in the village. Oh, so much going on. So I could supply Redfield with anything he wanted, you know, in the way of leads and information and suggestions. So we had a very cordial relationship.
It's interesting, that idea of studying the civilization instead of a village inside of a culture. You published a paper quite a bit later about ethnosociology.
Oh yes.
That seemed to speak to that.
Yes, that was certainly a Redfield idea. That he when I was working with him as an assistant, reading papers and things like that, anything that he said, well, this is just routine social science. That was, you know, that it would just take American social science and apply it, or, you know, use Weber or Marx or whatever you want, but to do it without asking their ideas was a big mistake. So the idea of working with indigenous logics, indigenous categories was fundamental, and I kept that in the back of my mind. I did a lot of statistical research at first that was pure American social science, I think, at the beginning. Lots of observations, I had thousands of little slips of particular observations of who's talking to who. I tried to identify everybody in the village. And then I would just wander around the village every day, the usual anthropological thing, trying to cover the whole picture, you see. Meet everybody, don't just get one informant. Everybody's your informant. But I wrote down everything that I saw, all day long. Very, very picky business. And then I added them all up, see. And I could see, one of the amazing things I saw right away was that people of different castes were friends. My God. You know, according to the literature, they never talked to each other. They never ate. They never did anything together. That wasn't the case at all. There were 1,000 people, and they were all doing, you know, they were all related to each other in special ways. But I had to then see that it wasn't just A and B talking, but it was A talking first and B talking second, or A sitting down and B standing up, and, you know, all the little niceties of social relations. I had to learn all of that. All this thousands of little slips, and they're useless. So God, the statistical approach, I had to learn their ways of counting things. So I'd ask, what did you see today? You know, and get their ideas. I did a lot of that kind of stuff, mostly just listening, not asking a whole lot of questions. I did try to do everything normal, you know, you would do in the way of getting a census and land records and all that kind of thing.
Now you went back for an extended period of research.
Yes.
A few years later.
A few years later, right.
Yeah, and what brought you back, and was it in this?
Well, it was the Green Revolution that brought me back.
Oh.
It was 19 years after my first stay. I stayed in the village more than a year. And then when I came back, I was quite focused, and I had by then worked up all the basic facts about the village, you know, and the old people, everybody was on a slip, and I had boxes and boxes of detailed information about the physical situation and everything else, really. But then I could see the tremendous changes going on. They'd gotten electricity. I actually helped bring the electricity in myself. I'm almost sorry for it, but because I like the old peasant culture an awful lot. You know, it was very, very interesting and so different. But I brought in the electricity that helped light the houses. They were getting some for wells, for pumps on electric pumps on wells. But there was so much going on. They were having the first national election the time I was there. In the first time rather, this was then another election had come along at this point. So I was seeing the second complete election of the village politics about this, and new laws had come in, and they were in the first time I was there, they were doing land reform. So they were giving bonds to the farmers who had to pay 10 times their rent in order to become owners. That is, the farmers, almost all the farmers were tenants under the old tenancy system. The new tenancy system made them owners, and they were paying directly to the government. They wiped out the landlord class that was in the middle. The landlord was being abolished. That was another. Landlordism was being abolished. So I'd known a lot of the landlords, and so it was a wonderfully tumultuous time for things happening. And in that year also, my house was robbed, and that turned out to be very fascinating because the village had to go into action to try to solve my crime, and of course they were full of hypotheses as to who done it, and that was very interesting because I had planned to do an economic survey in the fields at the time, but everywhere I went in the fields, people would say, "I'll tell you what to do." But I got wonderful field notes, you might say, on crime. And then I went after several months. The villagers said, "Well, this is terrible. This is a terrible reputation for our village that we robbed a guest, and you just got to go to the police. We haven't solved the problem." So I went to the police, and they said, "Don't go to the police." I mean, initially they said, "Don't go to the police. They'll just take a lot of bribes and we'll put the wrong person in jail." So I went to the police, and they came in. They said, "Well, we need your help." It was 6 miles from the police station, and we've got to come in at night. So you bring your Jeep and you carry us into the village. Well, that didn't sound like the role I wanted. As an anthropologist, turned out to be a policeman. So I said, "Well, okay, but you mustn't actually make me take the car. I'll stop the car a mile from the village." And they said, "Well, we'll give you a disguise. You can wear a police coat and cap and carry a big stick." And so on. So I did that. And then I hung. We went there at 2 a.m. or something like that, and tried to round up the usual suspects. And but I just stood in the shadows. You see, I stayed out, sort of observed this. They got one scallywag who was a sort of villain joker, and a dope seller, and one of my best informants. He was so full of wonderful folklore, but he was one of the guys they put the finger on, and they tortured him, and he confessed, in a sense, that is, he named the son of the landlord as the thief, which of course then the police went to the landlord and got a great big bribe. And I learned about this from the village kids, because the kids are all over everything, and most of the people were living outdoors in these courtyards that had no roofs. Their houses really just had sort of closets for storing grain or something, or getting out of the rain, but otherwise they were audible. And the kids were going over the walls all the time, listening to the gossip. And they'd seen the landlord pay the bribe, and they'd seen where the stolen goods were stowed in the landlord's grandmother's chest. And anyway, they gave me the full information. So then I actually had photographs of all of this, these procedures, I mean, many parts of them. And then I could go to the police and say, you took a bribe and you put the wrong man in jail. And I had given them a reward. I'd offered a reward for the solution thing just to get things going. I didn't have much longer to stay. And I then asked them to return the reward. So I had the police then, and then I got information from the police about how they operated. And I began to feel a bit worried because they had guns and I didn't. So I was glad to be leaving, but I thought I'd have trouble because I put the wrong man in jail. Well, actually, most people were glad to have the wrong man in jail because they didn't think he was the wrong man. He was waiting, he needed in jail. Well, he ultimately died in jail. And he was not a member of an important kin group in the village. So when I went back 19 years later, I thought, well, that's going to be some trouble for me there. I don't know. Nobody thought about it at all. In fact, I learned some of his poetic orations, which were very comical things that I'd learned from him. I'd written them all down phonetically so I could pull out my notes and read these things, you know. And villagers thought they were hilarious. But this dead man, this dead thief's orations were delightful. Everybody thought that was just fun. When I went back, I then lived in the head man's house in the second. They were really cordial to me, entirely different from the first time. And I was immediately brought into the head man's house. I was installed in his living room as my quarters for 6 months. And everybody wanted to come and see me and tell me all about them and all the things that had happened in the 19 years past. So it was a lovely time. Very, very fortunate.
I have two more. This has been so delightful. I have two more questions. One is just a question about your cohort, who your most important collaborators and colleagues were as you grew up in Indianist anthropology.
Well, there were a lot of them. A great many of them were ones I created, in the sense that is students. We had some wonderful, wonderful students, and I was blessed with students. At first, I was doing this routine stuff, doing my statistics and so on, and I had good people who I was wasting the time of, I think, by employing them, you know, as assistants. But as time went on, I learned a lot more, and my angles changed greatly. I went to the Behavioral Sciences Center for a year at Stanford, and that changed my mind about a lot of things. I was able to learn a lot of math that I hadn't learned in high school, and by then there was a lot of stuff that wasn't just ordinary statistics, but it was formal relations. So I was very impressed. I was impressed with, well, I had a man in sociology here who later went to Harvard, Harrison White, maybe.
Sure.
And but he inspired me. He said, look here, you can do graph theory and formal relations, which permits you to do just exactly what you wanted to do with caste. And it was really a godsend. It was entirely different. So I learned scaling and other non-parametric stuff and graphing. And I like to draw pictures, and I like that and I began doing three-dimensional graphing, and the 3 dimensions are really, I really went to town with, and that's what I'm working on now. But my other people in the university who inspired me were Not a whole lot. I mean, David Schneider did, but his American kinship stuff, I was attracted to because of its beautiful simplicity. Just a 2x2 square diagram was the essence of the whole thing. And I thought, well, that would be very interesting if I could do something as revealing as that, to sort of model Indian civilization in a little 2x2 diagram. But I couldn't do it, and it was clear that it didn't work. Well, then I had a couple of students who, I mean, then of course Schneider was affected by Levi-Strauss, and he wasn't the only one. Levi-Strauss was very much in fashion. Levi-Strauss came here, and but I read what I read of Levi-Strauss didn't work. The Indian things were not 2x2. They were not dichotomous. They were not. You couldn't talk about oppositions. You could talk about differences, about comparisons. You could do, but you couldn't. It didn't have any parametrics to them at all. That's like the Indian things, or maybe most things in the world don't. But the Indian ones certainly didn't. In fact, they're philosophically against it. So then my colleagues here in Indology were very important. Hans von Beitenen, for instance, he was an expert in not only Mahabharata, Sanskrit in general. He read it like a native, but he also was an expert on Sankhya. And Sankhya is the kind of, it's the most elemental, the most pervasive, and still the best known, and the most, I would say, structuring of all, comprehensive in the way that it structures all of Indian life. It deals with the 5 elements: earth, air, fire, water, ether. And I found, and I'm finding right now, that all of these are really very, very important. And you don't think, well, that's not social science, earth, air, fire, water. But it is, because they build a whole lot of social categories on it. They build qualities of the mind, kinds of human action, kinds of human sensation, everything in politics, food, religion. Everything is built on this 5 thing. Well, now it isn't really 5 dimensions, but there's 3 dimensions plus space, plus place, a location like Earth or something like that, or the location of anything, the container of anything. Anyway, I have now been working on interpreting these things in there are 5 or 6 different Indian schemes that are all parallel. None of the Indologists have seen that they're all parallel, and and I'm finding them in peasants, and in everyday life. So this is a big project and very exciting for me. So I was working with A.K. Ramanujan, and then later Van Beitenen unfortunately died, and but he took me into Sankhya, to Ayurveda, which is Indian medicine, Hindu medicine, and then I worked with Francis Zimmermann, who in Paris, who was a student of Dumont, and he was concentrating on Ayurveda, and so those are the principal people. The Indologists, Ramanujan, the poet, a dear friend, and we all learned so much from Ramanujan. It was just amazing. He was a poet and a linguist, and very interested in social science, and a folklorist. And he had done all this kind of South Indian folklore, so he was very good in pointing out where things were different in South India and all that. But very imaginative guy. So I just went around to all kinds of meetings with him, and he kept inviting me to India, and so we had a lovely, lovely time. Those guys, and then my students, and I had some wonderful students. And I had I directed about 30 or 40 PhDs, and most of them in India, and a very large part of them my kind of people. That is, that they wanted to do things in indigenous conceptual systems. and they went right for those issues that they could structure around local concepts and things, local logics, and swept away the nonsense. Our big bugaboo was Louis Dumont himself, because he was trained in anthropology, sort of. He actually didn't have a PhD in anthropology, but he'd hung around Marcel Mauss, the sociologist, and got himself a job in anthropology. In fact, he had never done anthropological field work in the usual sense. He'd done some interviewing out of context of members of a South Indian tribe. He never studied the caste system, and then he wrote a book on caste. This was crazy to me. But he tried to do a community study in Uttar Pradesh, but he fell ill, and he left after a couple of months. He never did a community study. He'd only studied uprooted tribal informants, and he'd only done their kinship. He knew nothing about rank. The first article I ever wrote, I published by accident because it was a field report that I'd written for my Professor Egan, actually. Got hold of it. I sent it to Lloyd Warner, and he gave it to Fred Egan, and Fred Egan said, well, we're starting up a new magazine about economic development, so why don't we publish this? He didn't ask me, just published it. And in the first number, the first volume of Economic Development, Cultural Change, this journal that was coming out of here, Bert Hoslet, bless his soul, was the editor. Nobody asked me. They published it. It had the real name of the village in it. I was trying to do it under a pseudonym. So they blew my cover in my very first publication. And this is bad because I wanted to publish all kinds of things that needed a cover about the village, crime and whatever else. Anyhow, it got me started. But in that article, especially in the second one, which was published with my approval later under a pseudonym, I focused it all on hierarchy, on the term which was used in American sociology just to mean up and down relations, just asymmetrical relations between people. But Dumont used the word. I had met him coming out of the field. I met him while he was writing up his South Indian kinship stuff at Oxford. I'd stopped by to see him. I was fascinated by his what he picked up from Levi-Strauss, I guess, which was the idea that marriage is not about extending the lineage. It's about getting brothers-in-law, about affinal relations. And that was fascinating, and I loved the article, one or two articles that he published, in fact, one article. And I had gone to Oxford to see him because I admired this article. It was so fresh and interesting. It raised all kinds of questions. I'd done a lot of kinship in the field and so on. We had fascinating conversation. But this idea of hierarchy, I mentioned it, I don't know, 20 times in that first article of mine. And he said, well, that's so surprising, He didn't understand about hierarchy. He doesn't even mention hierarchy in any of his, in his kinship work. He doesn't even see senior and junior as an issue. I mean, there's just no, it's all interchange, it's all marriage, and there's no descent to speak of. I mean, they put in the descent lines, but he doesn't understand high and low relations, which to me were the most utterly striking and for an American and egalitarian, to go in and find everything, every relationship is structured high and low somehow. Everything you say and the way you say it and so on. And then he amazed me by making this the topic of his book. He had no field work on it. And most of the people he quoted, there were old reports. He didn't have any students working in the field. He didn't have detailed. He picked up some stuff from Adrian Nair. Well, Adrian did very well, but he did not systematize it, and he did not theorize the high-low stuff. So it was the only approximation, and basically he just got it wrong, terribly wrong. But he claimed it was all, and then he went back, he insisted it was all French sociology. He was going in at a time of de Gaulle, I guess, was in power then. He told me that he had to get a job in Paris. He really didn't know anything about North India. But he had to get a job there, and he had, as a prisoner of war, he learned Sanskrit. Well, he was captured in Maginot, so he had several years studying in prisoner camp Sanskrit. So he knew some Sanskrit, but he didn't know much, and he hadn't done any Sanskrit in context. So he didn't know any Ayurveda, he didn't know any Sankhya, he didn't know any the real basics. But he was writing it all in terms of Brahmins. He spent this 3 months in a Brahmin village, in a Brahmin household, really, where he was sick for 3 months. And he got the Brahmin view, and he published it, and then everybody, it was pure French sociology. The hierarchy that he was talking about was the French Catholic Church. And he uses the word, he says, hierarchy is all religious. Well, it didn't look religious at all where I was. It was, ownership, it was power, it was people getting beaten up, it was, it was high and low class, you find extreme stratification, which people didn't understand what hierarchy. Oh yes, you could say there was something to do with purity and pollution. That's true, but that wasn't the rationale. It wasn't anything. It wasn't. Anyway, that was the big problem. But the world wanted to study that because it was so European, and everybody went crazy. Well, not everybody, but a lot of people did, and that was all. Then that really was a big problem. So my students all had to say it is not the way the Mal says. And then they were attacking Dumont and so on, so we had a lot of wasted time over polemics. But anyhow, the students were great, and I just had one after the other, and particularly it was wonderful because they would each go and they did really proper field work. They'd all go and they'd stay a year or two and they'd live in the community and they'd do the whole community and pick up all kinds of stuff. So I was very pleased with a lot of the results. And many of them were women, and they began working. This is a time when a lot of women were coming into anthropology for the first time, and they were doing things that had never been done before, in talking about kinship in India and families. So I had several wonderful sources of information. These people, then the Social Science Research Council of New York, I went back to, and we had a person there named David Zanton, who was actually done a PhD on the Philippines here with Fred Egan, and he'd become the sort of person who was supposed to deal with most of Asia, I think, at the time at the Social Science Research Council. And he came here and asked us what do we do, and what should we do with India. And Ron Inden and Ralph Nicholas were my students. And Ron was actually a student in history. Nicholas was my student in anthropology, my second student, I guess, here. They had gotten to work on Bengali kinship, and they were using indigenous ways of talking about kinship. And their book was wonderful as far as I was concerned. It was really exciting. And they were working alongside me. They were working with Schneider, but they were having a fight with Schneider pretty soon because Schneider wanted it all to look like Israeli kinship or something. It didn't. So Schneider had great difficulty with because he loved to torture people, and he would. I was very attracted to him and to his ideas, and found him a fascinating guy. But he started a cabal against me. And so I had 3 terrible years as chairman while he was trying to besmirch my reputation in every conceivable way. And he had a clique of students that were supposed to denounce me in various ways, and it was awful. But nevertheless, I had Nicholas and Inden's Bengali book to work with, and that was a great asset. So they and the women students, and then the Social Science Research Council picked up all of this whole business of indigenous conceptual systems that they were working with, and by then I really had something going, and they gave me 6 years actually, 6 years support from Social Science Research Council, so I could run a seminar here with bringing in guests. Instead of doing it all in one big blast, we decided that we had to train people. So because the anthropologists had to learn a lot of Indology, and the Indologists we worked with had to learn some anthropology, and we needed people to go back and forth between the social sciences and the humanities. And it was an ideal situation because we have a growing program here in South Asia, and it was a very happy time. So we had visitors coming in and a lot of attendance, and they were all writing interesting things. Val Daniel and these other people, Columbia and Sherry Ortner. They were just a great lot of people. And that, of course, is over now. But it was a great boost. That's how we were able to, that's why I was able to get a whole bunch of dissertations done. And each time a new dissertation would get done, that would come back into the seminar, and the next group of students would then.
Well, on the way over, Andreas was telling us that Indian studies is phenomenally strong here in Chicago. So clearly it has.
It has been, because right now we have very little. It's all totally different, and I think it probably should be. But they certainly lost the sense of the whole, as far as I can see. And nobody's talking about civilization, so that's what I have to do.